back, everyone. So today we're going to take a fresh look at Timothy Jones Jr. In case you have forgotten who Timothy Jones Jr. is, he is the father from South Carolina who killed all 5 of his own children in the most horrific ways possible. He tortured them all before he killed them. So today, this is an audio file that I had done previously that you may not have heard because it was on the now closed down podcast channel, The Murderer's Row. So there's only one picture and the rest of it is just an audio file. So sit back, listen, and I hope you enjoy the information within this actual file. Thank you for joining me today. Around 1 a.m. on the summer night of 2014, Timothy Jones Jr. loaded his oldest of his 5 children, Merah, age 8, into his Cadillac Escalade and drove to a nearby convenience store for cigarettes. Back home, his second oldest child, 7-year-old Eli, waited in terror next to the body of his dead brother, Nahtahn, age 6, for his father's return and along with his sister. The 2 youngest children, Gabe, age 2, and Abigail Elaine, age 1, were asleep. My life is fucked, Jones thought to himself, according to his confession. Instead of calling police to tell them that he had accidentally killed Nahtahn, Jones returned to the family Red Bank mobile home on August 29, 2014, and strangled the remaining children, 2 with his hands and 2 with a belt. And 3 days later, before Father's Day, a Lexington County jury sent Jones to South Carolina's death row, where he joins 37 other condemned killers. Today, the 37-year-old wears a bright green jumpsuit that marks death row inmates from general population. General population wears orange. He lives in a 6-foot by 14-foot cell painted white in one of the most secure housing units in state history in a complex on Broad River Road in Columbia. His cell door is slightly deeper color of blue with a small window and narrow slots for the guards to pass food through 3 times a day, 6 days a week, and on Sunday he only enjoys 2 meals, brunch and supper. The father methodically killed his 5 children, one by one, is amongst the most bizarre and demented killings ever in South Carolina, a state that has seen its fair share of grisly crimes. At the times, Jones had it all: an $80,000 a year software job at Intel, faith in the Bible, and 5 beautiful children and a bright future. How could someone kill their 5 children? Jones' defense attorney argued that he was poisoned fruit from a toxic family tree, rotted by several mental illnesses, drug abuse, alcoholism, incest, multiple suicides, child abuse, parental abandonment. Gripped by insane delusions and fueled by synthetic marijuana, Jones fell apart under the stress of a broken marriage and demands for caring for 5 children. More than a half a dozen mental health experts addressed Jones. Their findings range from insane to mentally troubled but faking extreme symptoms during the trial. He was said to carry on with mental delusions while locked up in the county jail. One court-appointed psychiatrist testified that although Jones claimed to hear voices, they were probably his own anxious thoughts, nothing more than that. Defense attorney Boyd Young summed up his client in these terms: killing children you love is insane. Or maybe Jones was an evil killer who plotted out the murders, made plans to burn his children's bodies and evade the law for more than a week. As the 11th Circuit Solicitor Rick Hubbard said, Hubbard told the jury he didn't believe Jones' story that he killed little Nathan by accident, forcing the child to do extreme exercises until he died. This was later proved to be absolutely true. There was no signs that little Nathan had actually exercised at all in the driveway like Jones had repeated over and over again. There was no signs, no cuts, no bruises on any part of his body other than around his neck where his father had strangled him with his own 2 hands. Hubbard said Jones killed Nathan while in a hot rage and ripped up his favorite Woody doll, which was found in shreds all over the front yard. Folks, the bottom line is this. He knew what he was doing, Hubbard said, calling Jones a monster. This man knew right from wrong when he did it, and he chose wrong every single time. The debate will rage on forever, though, through the appeals process and until the day that Jones draws his last breath. His mother, Cynthia Turner, was diagnosed with schizophrenia and has been living in an adult psychiatric facility for many years. She never wanted a fat baby, so she refused to feed little Timothy, as he was called throughout childhood. She fed him laxatives to cleanse his body. She plunged him into cold ice water baths where he would scream and cry, and she sat alone in the closet cutting up his clothing and her clothing with scissors or steak knives, Timothy Jones Sr. would recount later. Timothy Jones Sr. had his own issues with drug abuse and alcohol and domestic violence, and felt his wife was unstable and began sleeping with one eye open, according to court testimony. Timothy watched his mother's mental health spiral out of control, eventually requiring around-the-clock care. As a child, his mother would leave home and become a prostitute for months at a time, and then come home with no recollection of what she had actually done or where she had been or how she had fed herself. But she knew she had slept with a lot of men. She knew she had gotten paid for it, but she couldn't make the connection that she was actually prostituting herself in and around the Charlotte, North Carolina, and other areas around southern states. Jones Sr., then 20, moved with his son into his mother's home, where the child was exposed to a world of domestic violence, drugs, and alcohol abuse, along with satanic rituals from an uncle. But everyone could tell early on that Timothy had a gift. He was a brilliant child and could have been his own salvation. He was skilled with numbers and decoding mathematical problems with ease. Tim Sr. was proud of his son and took out a bank loan to buy his son his very first computer, a $2,000 computer. But he was puzzled when he found Timothy taking it all apart, computer parts surrounding him everywhere on the floor, as he sat there and walked in and said, "What did you do to your new gift? Why did you take it apart?" Timothy looked up at him from the floor and says, "I'm fixing it." In response, the next day the computer was reassembled into a faster, better machine, Timothy Sr. said. But everything had changed as Timothy entered his teen years. He told the psychiatrist that he first started hearing voices at around the age of 10 or 12, and he started smoking marijuana heavily and drinking heavily before ever entering high school. At age 15, he suffered a traumatic brain injury in a car accident, which left him with what he called a broken brain. A doctor testified at his trial a portion of his frontal lobe was effectively damaged because of shards from his brain skull had been pushed into the frontal lobe, where they would remain for the rest of his life. The frontal lobe controls impulse control. His behavior became erratic. Interactions with Jones was like walking on eggshell, a lot of people had said. He grew overly jealous with anyone who had his dad's attention. And when Jones Sr. fell in love and married, Jones felt that his dad had chosen someone else over him. "I'll get her eventually. I know I will," he would go later on to tell a psychiatrist along with a family friend. As he got older, he felt his dad didn't love him anymore, and he feared he would one day wind up just like his mother, locked away in an institution with nobody caring for him at all. As smart as he was, he lacked the emotional intelligence, common sense, and empathy. His dad often said he was 26 going on 16. After high school, Jones had a delusion of becoming a Navy SEAL. Despite the fact that only a small percentage of athletically gifted, mentally tough recruits make the cut, as his family expected, Jones only lasted a few weeks in the Navy boot camp before being discharged. Others found him crying alone in a corner, and he was given a general discharge on substance abuse and extreme depression. They sent him home with no follow-up at all. They didn't care. The government just tossed him aside and said, go back to wherever you came from. You're broken. We don't want you. On returning home in 2000, he started hanging out with the wrong crowd, drinking, smoking, partying, and every day it was something else new. Timothy Jones Sr. went on to say. One day the police showed up. In addition to cocaine possession, car theft, burglary, Jones was caught writing bad checks in his dad's name on a totally new account. The police told Jones Sr. if he didn't press charges against his son, he would have to be arrested. The bank wanted someone held responsible. In 2001, Jones was sent to Illinois State Prison work boot camp for 1 year and returned a changed man. He had found religion, and he saw it as a roadmap to the right way of living. He memorized Bible quotes and would browbeat anyone at church or in public with what he had known and what he had recited and remembered from the boot camp. I thought it was a damn cult, said Jones Sr. He just lost his mind. Sure, we all could use some religion, some guidance in this life, but here my son is browbeating anyone. He'd go to the store and he'd browbeat the clerk for 40 minutes over the price of a pack of cigarettes, or what he seen as a issue in her life where the clerk was not living a fruitful and direct life. Jones met the mother of his children, Amber, while they were working together at Chicago-based Enchanted Castle. He started to take her to his Pentecostal church in 2004. They married within weeks. The church expected couples to marry right away. She was 19, he was 22. In Jones, Amber saw an intellectual man grounded in religion who was building a life for himself. She didn't have much. She came from nothing, and he was going places. He had a future. It had a way and a mystique about it all, she would later recount, that he was here, the knight in shining armor. But when Jones took a liking to her, she knew she was hooked. Here it is. The knight in shining armor has rode in to save me. But Amber learned that Jones' church was strict. Women were not allowed to cut their hair, ever. They could not wear pants. They could not wear makeup. They could not wear jewelry. They must be subservient to a man's use and desires. Tim's motto was a woman was supposed to be fruitful and multiply. Amber told the jury at Jones's trial, a woman is supposed to listen to her husband, to be there, to do whatever he says every single day and night. If he said, jump up and down, I would jump up and down. If he said, run to the other side of the house and then back, I would run to the other side of the house and back, and then wait for him to give me the next order on what I should do. This was an everyday occurrence throughout our entire existence together. Jones threw himself into the faith, praying in tongues at church and disciplining his children with beatings. As he believed the Bible clearly instructed in the 23rd chapter of Proverbs, such punishment was good for children, he believed. For the Bible said, without not correction from the child, for it is thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die. He ignored what people had been telling him for years. You shouldn't take everything in the Bible literally, Timothy. Please, stop. Stop what you're doing now. The family would pick up and move to Mississippi, where Jones eventually graduated from Mississippi State University, the first in his family to ever attend any type of education beyond high school, let alone go to college and finish. He graduated summa cum laude, Latin with highest honors, with a degree in computer science and in engineering. All the while, the marriage and the children were working, several jobs, working at a convenience store at night, and then turning around after school in the afternoon and working several dead-end jobs as a laborer and also as a janitor for several different computer companies and local accounting firms. His family couldn't have been prouder. His dad thought he could do anything. He could become anything he wanted to be. Everything was moving in the right direction when he landed a competitive job at the computer chip maker Intel. For Amber, this was the family's chance at a better life. Finally, a way to get out of poverty, she saw. After living in student housing at Mississippi State, they'd be able to raise their 3 children in a big home. She would have plenty of help and even be able to get a nanny or a housekeeper. Instead, Jones chose to buy a rundown rambled trailer on Red Dirt Road in South Carolina. In addition to his full-time job, he wanted the homestead and bought 30 chickens, 3 goats, 2 turkeys, 3 rabbits. And Amber would stay home with the animals and children. It was in an isolated area, and she didn't have a car or even know how to drive. By 2013, the 2 more children had been added to the family. Jones wanted Amber to homeschool the children, but she didn't even have a high school diploma herself. Amber felt inadequate and cut off from the world. She had no family nearby. She had no friends. She had nothing. It was 6 miles to the nearest town where I could even go to buy simple groceries. I would have to gather up the children, put them in a wagon, and walk the 6 miles into town to buy even a carton of milk. This is his plan. He wanted us to be there, in the middle of nowhere. I was so alone, so overwhelmed. I wanted to leave, but how can I leave? He knew that I was there alone on this homestead in the middle of nowhere, a rundown shack, and here we were with $80, $90, $200,000 in the bank, and he wouldn't buy me anything. He wouldn't buy me a new dress. He wouldn't buy me even a wedding ring. We still had the same plastic wedding rings and bands that he got us when we worked back in Chicago. Amber was overwhelmed. Amber eventually had an affair with the neighbor down the road. In 2012, she left the marriage for any chance that she could. The first person that came along and expressed any interest in her, she ran. Amber never looked back. He impressed her as a smart, loving father and wanted the best for his children. But that wasn't the Jones that I knew. The Jones that I knew inside. In 2012, as the marriage fell apart, Jones met with a Columbia therapist, April Hames. He impressed her that he was just a hard-working man who would do anything for his children. Jones didn't want Amber to be part of the kids' lives, and he asked the therapist to write an affidavit for his divorce attorney, stating that Jones was fit to bring up his children at home alone. Amber had no such affidavit. She didn't even have an attorney. Jones was given primary custody as the sole financial provider, while she was granted regular visitation in their final monthly together and their final visitations. Jones became violent towards Amber, going as far as knocking out her back teeth when he headbutted her, and another time slamming a phone into her face and breaking out the teeth on the other side. And he said, "Look, now you're ugly. No man will ever want you." And then he spat on her in front of her children. Mentally, Jones was starting to spiral out of control. He started using drugs and alcohol again. He was wrestling with the voices in his head he would later tell a psychiatrist. And as time went by, Jones became increasingly angry about the little things. Anything would set him off. There was nothing that didn't have the ultimate powder keg behind it. He hired a succession of babysitters to take care of his children while he worked. Jones was distressed about his failed marriage, but it kept an immaculate home. Everything was in its place. You couldn't find a toy outside the box. matter of fact, two babysitters would later go on to testify that every child would go to this toy box and then pick out one toy for all 5 children to play with, because they didn't want to fear making a mess and making Daddy angry. He hired a succession of babysitters who all would quit eventually over simple things that Jones just couldn't get past. 2 babysitters would later testify that Jones had a violent streak, that he would punish his children for hours at a time. Then he hired Crystal Ballantine, who was just 17 years old at the time and had an infant daughter. She later would become his live-in lover, accompanying him to the fundamentalist church in the local area. But the relationship began to sour. He insisted Ballantine adopt the ways of his church, wearing long dresses, growing her hair out, and being submissive to him. And he saw how he punished his children, hitting them pretty hard, she said, making them stand on their tippy toes in the corners for hours at a time. He believed spanking and corporal punishment was medicine for the sick body. The final straw was when she found him preparing to discipline her daughter with a whip. The infant child with a whip. After Ballantine left, another babysitter, Lori Joylick, grew increasingly concerned about the mobile home's disarray. Trash, dirty clothes covering the floor, roaches moved in, and Jones continued with his brutal punishment and formed a habit of feeding only his child oatmeal all day for days and days on end, feeding the children only oatmeal twice a day. Once before Lorick left for the day, the children begged her, "Could you not tell Daddy that you just fed us? Because he might not feed us again. This might be our last meal. Daddy believes in the Bible. Daddy is going to not feed us. Please, don't tell Daddy you fed us. Just tell him you forgot." In August 2014, several weeks before the children were killed, Laura called the South Carolina Department of Social Services and reported the lack of food in the home and physical abuse. Laura didn't know that teachers at Gotham Elementary School had already notified the agency of physical abuse in months prior, and that the agency had already required Jones to make a written promise that he would never spank or beat his children again and would feed them on a regular basis something besides just oatmeal. But the social services investigator went to interview the wrong babysitter. She interviewed the wrong babysitter according to court testimony and state documents. The children's mother, who was represented by Dick Hamplepullen of Richland County, had filed a lawsuit against social services seeking damages for the child's alleged wrongful deaths as by a known child abuser who abused when uninterrupted by social services. The deaths were entirely preventable, claimed the lawsuit. The agency has denied all allegations, but had to release the 29-page report that showed that they interviewed the wrong babysitter not once, but 5 times. During the trial, the Gulf teachers and administrators and babysitters cried during testimony, describing the children as 5 of the most beautiful, wonderful, and innocent children on God's green earth. 5 beautiful treasures, the prosecutor Hubert put it. Jones seemed to have an idea he might wind up in prison when he took Merah to the store that day to buy cigarettes on that fateful evening in 2014. He had downloaded and watched a clip of the prison rape scene from the movie American History X. A total of 13 times he watched it. As Nahtahn lay dead before him in the living room, and he decided to then kill the next child, and then the next one, and then the next one. He was right. Today, Jones spends 23 hours a day in a narrow cell that is slightly bigger than a walk-in closet, with only one window that never looks outside but into a hallway. A typical breakfast of grits, eggs, and biscuits and juice. For lunch, he gets meals such as turkey, rice, and gravy, and vegetables. For supper, something like spaghetti with, and green beans and salad. Nothing over the top, nothing but basic food over and over again. It has been 22 years since the prison there has changed their meal plan. For 22 years, people on death row have been receiving the same meals every single day. Jones is a rarity on death row. None of South Carolina's 37 other condemned killers has murdered 5 children. Let alone 5 of their own children. At most of the state's condemned killers come from lower social economic strata. Few, if any, have a high school diploma. But here's Jones with an elite education and the prestige of working for one of the top technology companies, making over $80,000 a year, not including bonuses. Jones might be there an awfully long time. One inmate, Fred Singleton, age 75 currently, from Newberry County, has been on death row since 1983, 36 years. South Carolina hasn't executed anyone since 2011. It is almost impossible for the Department of Corrections to get the drugs necessary for lethal injections, although the state law does allow executions by electric chair, but the inmate is the only one that is allowed to choose the way they will die, either by electrocution or lethal injection. There's always the possibility a higher court could overturn the guilty verdict, or more likely the death sentence. In this case, prosecutors would have to decide whether to retry Jones. What does it all mean? Perhaps the best description of Jones' life was given by his father at the trial. A train wreck. A slow train wreck that he never recovered from. I hope you enjoyed the audio version of this case today. Timothy Jones Jr. Update. As of January 2021, Timothy Jones Jr. sits on death row in South Carolina, where he has been ever since he was found guilty of these horrific acts of killing all his children. Timothy Jones Jr. has, according to the Department of Corrections, a total of 10 different pen pals who write him every single week, who put money on Timothy Jones Jr.'s prison inmate account so he can buy snacks and other goodies while he is in his cell for 23 hours a day. Of those who are pen pals of Timothy Jones Jr., Timothy Jones Jr. has received not 1, but 8 requests for marriage since he has been on death row. 8 different women have asked Timothy Jones Jr. to marry them. Timothy Jones Jr. locked away in a cell for 23 hours a day with no chance to ever see daylight. His window looks out into a hallway at another wall. To his left, he can see another door. To his right, he can see another door. Every inmate treated the same way. Every day that Timothy Jones Jr. is alive, he draws one more breath that he doesn't deserve. Well, that's the end of the video. I hope you truly enjoyed this video. If you did, give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment, share it with your friends. Along with, if you would like to see more of these videos and more content from me, there is the subscribe button down there and the bell icon that you can click on. And with the bell icon, you need to know that there are 3 different options with the bell icon. You can be notified of every single video that I put out, occasionally be notified, or just some of the videos that I put out. It's 3 different options there with the bell icon. So if you'd like to subscribe, I would really appreciate that. Along with, I also offer channel membership and Patreon for this channel. Thank you very much for watching today, and God bless you, and stay safe out there.